Welcome to Mindset Matters Book Club YouTube channel. Please subscribe and like to hear new book summaries.
We are so excited to get into this one today.
Yeah, absolutely. So we typically operate under this really comforting illusion that medicine is this discipline of just absolute unshakable precision, right? We treat it like mechanical engineering.
Oh, completely. It's that idea of, a very binary system.
Right. Like you fall off a bicycle, you shatter your radius, and the emergency room takes an x-ray. The doctor clips that film to the light board, points to a very obvious jagged white line cutting across the bone and says, there is the problem.
Yeah. And that provides a really profound sense of psychological safety for us. We just, we crave those binary systems, especially when our health is on the line.
Totally.
I mean, the bone is broken or the bone is intact. You have a bacterial infection or you do not. We basically spent the last century and a half building this entire medical infrastructure that fundamentally worships the visible.
Yes, the quantifiable, right?
Yeah.
The stuff that's neatly categorizable.
Exactly. But the problem is what happens when you step outside that neatly categorizable framework.
Which happens a lot. Like when you step into the world of chronic fatigue or neurodevelopmental disorders, or unexplainable autoimmune flare-ups.
Or sudden debilitating stomach pains that seemingly have no origin whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly. Suddenly that metaphorical x-ray machine is just completely useless. You're staring at a blank screen, but the patient is still, sitting there screaming in pain.
It's a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky. And honestly, it's just terrifying for the people who are trapped inside it.
It really is. And we're spending our time today in the absolute epicenter of those diagnostic muddy waters. Today's deep dive is into a truly paradigm-shifting book called It's Not Just in Your Head, Demystifying the Brain-Body Connection in Medical Illness.
Written by the incredible Dr. Susan B. Trachman.
Yes. She is an MD, a board-certified psychiatrist, and she has, decades of clinical experience, specifically in psychosomatic medicine. And the mission of this deep dive, her core mission with this book, really is to completely dismantle a deeply entrenched, centuries-old philosophical error in medicine.
You're talking about the idea that the brain and the body are running on two completely separate operating systems.
Precisely that. Descartes, right.
Yeah, René Descartes, the 17th century philosopher, he gave us mind-body dualism. He essentially argued that the material body was a machine and the mind was this immaterial, separate entity.
And modern medicine basically just adopted that dualism hook, line, and sinker.
It did. It treats the physical body, the organs, the bones, the blood, like a biological engine. And it treats the mind, our psychology, our stress, our emotions, like some ethereal ghost hovering nearby.
Right, a ghost that supposedly has no mechanical bearing on the engine itself. But Dr. Trachman just marshals an overwhelming amount of hard biological science to prove that the brain and the body actually act as an intimately connected bidirectional unit. And honestly, exploring that bidirectional unit is going to validate a massive population of people who have been historically left behind.
Oh, without a doubt.
Because for you listening, anyone who has ever sat on that crinkly paper of a medical exam table feeling physically broken, only to have a physician vaguely suggest you're just stressed, the unique devastation of that moment.
It is a unique kind of trauma to be told your reality is an illusion. I mean, to really understand the gravity of Dr. Trachman's solution, we have to deeply analyze the current crisis in primary care.
Right. She frames this around a concept called medically unexplained symptoms, or MUS. And the statistics she outlines regarding MUS are just an absolute indictment of our current diagnostic models.
The numbers are frankly staggering. When you look at the front lines of medicine, like primary care clinics and urgent cares, there are 10 specific complaints that absolutely dominate the waiting rooms.
Things like chest pain, profound fatigue, dizziness,
severe headaches, unexplained swelling, chronic back pain,
shortness of breath, intractable insomnia, severe abdominal pain, and peripheral numbness. Those 10 complaints alone account for almost 40% of all adult primary care visits.
Wait, 40%?
Yeah. Nearly half the people seeking medical help on any given day.
That is massive. But the critical failure point is the outcome of those specific visits. Because when doctors run their standard biomedical playbook, the blood panels looking for elevated white blood cells, the MRIs, the EKGs, the purely biological visible cause is only found about 25% of the time.
Which means the system is completely failing to find an answer for the vast majority of those patients.
Exactly. And the book grounds the statistical reality in the story of a patient named Lucy. This wasn't just a case of someone having a mild headache for a day either.
No, Lucy spent years visiting multiple specialists. She was dealing with this awful cascade of physical symptoms. We're talking crushing fatigue, joint pain, serious gastrointestinal distress.
And she was subjected to every scan and lab test imaginable, right?
Every single one. And every single test came back stamped normal.
And because the tests were normal, the medical establishment essentially abandoned her. She was repeatedly told, sometimes subtly and sometimes overtly, that she was manufacturing her suffering.
That it was all in her head.
Exactly. And the fallout from this kind of systemic dismissal operates on two distinct levels. The first is obviously emotional. The patient begins to question their own sanity. They lose faith in their physical senses.
Which is heartbreaking. But the second level is macroeconomic, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. Individuals suffering from medically unexplained symptoms take significantly more sick leave. They experience higher rates of long-term unemployment. And paradoxically, they drain massive amounts of healthcare resources.
Well, yeah, because they refuse to just go home and suffer in silence. I mean, who would? They start doctor shopping, bouncing from a rheumatologist to a gastroenterologist, just desperately hunting for someone who will order the one magical test.
The test that finally reveals that jagged white line on the X-ray.
Exactly. They are trapped on a diagnostic carousel, generating enormous healthcare costs through repeated, unnecessary procedures.
And they are undergoing these procedures because the reigning medical paradigm simply does not know where else to point the flashlight.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. I want to use the analogy from the book to conceptualize why this is happening. Imagine your entire biological organism as a massive multinational corporation.
Okay, I like this one.
Your brain is the CEO sitting up in the corner office. Your organ systems, your gastrointestinal tract, your cardiovascular system, your immune system, they are the regional managers out in the field.
Right, so if the manager of the gut sends a panicked report up to the brain saying there is a severe problem with digestion, the CEO has to react.
Exactly. The brain alters behaviors, signals pain, maybe forces the body to lie down, but the pathway runs in reverse too.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, if the CEO is under constant severe attack, say, dealing with chronic psychological trauma or severe financial stress, that stress doesn't just stay in the corner office.
No, the CEO blasts out chemical memos in the form of stress hormones. That panic trickles down through the nervous system, and suddenly every regional branch feels the pressure.
The gut stops digesting properly, the heart beats erratically, the immune system starts misfiring. It is a completely closed loop.
So if it is so clearly a closed biological loop, why is the modern medical community so quick to separate them? Like, why is it so difficult for a highly educated physician to look at a patient with stomach pain and consider the state of the CEO in the corner office?
To understand that blind spot, we really have to examine the architecture of medical education itself. Dr. Trachman provides a very revealing, almost visceral anecdote from her own time in medical school.
Oh, with Dr. Kent, right.
Yes. She describes this notoriously intimidating professor she calls Dr. Kent. His entire teaching methodology involved walking the hospital corridors, pointing at vulnerable patients, and demanding instant objective biological answers from his students.
Yeah, she remembers him spotting an older man shuffling down the hall, turning to her and aggressively barking, "Trachman, diagnosis."
Right in the hallway. It sounds less like an educational environment and more like a military boot camp designed to strip out all the nuance.
It really conditions young doctors to value immediate, objective biological certainty above absolutely everything else.
The hidden curriculum there is that a good doctor can look at a physical sign, instantly match it to a known cellular pathology, and name the disease.
But when a patient like Lucy walks in with medically unexplained symptoms, that entire framework just collapses. The tools the doctor spent a decade mastering suddenly don't work.
And rather than questioning the limitations of the tools, human nature kicks in. The doctor feels a loss of authority. They feel inadequate.
And sadly, that internal frustration often gets externalized right onto the patient. The language becomes incredibly dismissive.
A doctor might say, well, the labs are pristine, so there is nothing wrong with you. Or they might use condescending phrasing like, you're just having spells.
Or the ultimate modern brush-off. You need to stop using Dr. Google and making yourself anxious.
It's entirely a defense mechanism. It shifts the blame for the medical mystery from the limitations of the science to the psychology of the patient.
Think about the vulnerability of that. Yes, the BPS model. Now, this framework isn't exactly new, is it?
No, it was actually conceptualized back in 1977 by George Engel. He was uniquely positioned because he was both a psychiatrist and an internist.
Oh, so he really had a foot in both worlds.
Exactly. Engel looked at the reigning biomedical model, the strict belief that every illness is solely the result of a biological deviation, like a rogue virus or a genetic mutation, and he realized it was fundamentally incomplete.
Because treating the human body purely as a biological engine ignores the environment that the engine operates in.
Right. You can replace the spark plugs all you want, but if the driver is intentionally steering the car into a brick wall every afternoon, the engine is going to keep breaking down.
That is a great way to put it. The BPS philosophy argues that illness is a complex dynamic interaction of three major spheres.
The biological sphere is obviously vital pathogens and genetics matter, but illness is also heavily dictated by psychological factors. What is the patient's emotional state? Have they experienced severe emotional neglect or acute trauma?
Are they enduring chronic, inescapable stress? And finally, the social environment. What is their socioeconomic status? Do they have a robust support network, or are they isolated?
Are they living in a polluted neighborhood or working a toxic, hyper-demanding job? All of that matters physically.
And the book uses the management of chronic pain to demonstrate just how revolutionary this three-pronged approach can be. Chronic pain is an absolute epidemic right now.
It affects roughly 50 million Americans, and it drains almost $70 billion from the economy annually in medical treatments and lost productivity.
Historically, the biomedical model viewed pain as a simple biological hardware problem. Nerve ending detects damage, nerve sends signal to brain, brain registers pain.
So the solution was purely biological. Flood the system with painkillers, block the nerve signal, and the problem is solved.
But the opioid epidemic is the tragic result of treating a biopsychosocial problem with a purely biological tool.
Exactly. The BPS model completely transformed pain management by acknowledging the sheer complexity of the nervous system. Pain is not just a raw electrical signal traveling up the spinal cord.
No, that signal has to pass through complex neurobiological gateways, particularly in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, before it even reaches the brain.
And those gateways can be cranked wide open or slammed shut by psychology and environment.
So when pain clinics started adopting the BPS model, they didn't just prescribe medication. They began incorporating comprehensive nutritional education, recognizing that certain diets cause systemic inflammation that makes nerves hypersensitive.
They conducted sleep assessments too, because a brain deprived of REM sleep literally loses its ability to internally regulate pain signals.
They worked with patients to moderate alcohol use, and crucially, they introduced cognitive behavioral therapy to address the psychological stress and anxiety that physically amplifies the perception of pain.
The book includes a quote from Plato that perfectly encapsulates this. The part can never be well unless the whole is well.
It is a beautiful sentiment, but I think this is the exact moment where a skeptic listening might push back.
How so?
Because if we are saying that psychological stress and a bad social environment are causing the physical illness, aren't we just circling right back to the idea that the patient is making themselves sick?
Ah, I see what you mean.
Like, how do we differentiate between an illness that is imagined or purely psychosomatic and a biologically real illness that just happens to be triggered by psychosocial factors?
It is the most critical distinction in the entire book.
Ah,
We have to violently separate the concept of psychologically influenced from imagined.
right, because the pain a patient feels is biologically real. The crippling fatigue is biologically real.
Exactly. The BPS model does not suggest that patients are thinking themselves into being sick.
Yeah.
What it reveals is the deeply mechanistic biological reality of psychological factors.
So stress isn't just an abstract feeling. It is a physical hammer hitting the biological machinery.
Yes, perfectly said. Let's look at the mechanics of chronic stress. When you perceive a threat, whether it is a physical predator or the crushing pressure of medical debt, your hypothalamus signals your pituitary gland, which in turn signals your adrenal glands.
This is the HPA axis, right?
Yes. Your adrenal glands dump massive amounts of cortisol and adrenaline into your bloodstream. This is a brilliant biological adaptation for a short-term crisis.
It gets your heart pumping and shuts down non-essential functions like digestion so you can fight or run away.
But if that psychosocial stress is chronic, if it never stops, your system is bathed in a toxic, never-ending flood of cortisol.
And chronic cortisol exposure fundamentally alters your immune function. It degrades the lining of your blood vessels, and it leads to profound epigenetic changes.
We really need to unpack epigenetics because that is the mechanism that proves the environment physically changes us.
Let's do it. Think of your DNA, your genetic code, as the physical keys on a piano. Those keys are fixed. You are born with them.
But epigenetics is the sheet music. It dictates which keys are played, how loudly, and when.
Right. Psychological stress creates chemical changes, specifically a process called DNA methylation that literally attach to your genes and turn them on or off.
Chronic stress can alter the epigenetic sheet music to turn off the genes responsible for regulating inflammation and turn on the genes that promote autoimmune responses. The environment literally rewrites how your biology functions at a cellular level.
And Dr. Trachman includes an incredible historical anecdote in the book's epilogue that perfectly validates this environmental impact. She points to Louis Pasteur, the founding father of germ theory.
The ultimate biomedical pioneer, the man who firmly established the idea that one specific microbe causes one specific disease.
But at the very end of his life, while conducting extensive studies on infectious diseases devastating silkworm populations, he had a massive revelation.
He realized that the microbe was only half the equation. He noted that if he could conduct his life's work all over again, he would focus entirely on the conditions under which the silkworms were raised.
Yes. He observed that the ambient temperature, the crowding of the environment, the quality of their food, these psychosocial and environmental factors completely determine whether the silkworm's immune system could resist the microbe or succumb to it.
The man who invented pasteurization realized that the bug itself is relatively powerless if the host's environment is pristine. The environment is the ultimate biological variable.
Which brings us out of the realm of broad theory and into some very specific concrete biology. The book takes us on a deep dive into how two major physiological systems, the heart and the gut, communicate directly and constantly with the brain.
Let's start with the cardiovascular system. The relationship between the heart and the brain is perhaps the most heavily researched proof of the BPS model.
Dr. Trachman details the profound, bidirectional link between clinical depression and cardiovascular disease, or CVD.
When we use the term bidirectional, we mean that the causality flows both ways. It is intuitive to understand that surviving a massive heart attack could traumatize a patient and cause depression.
Sure, but the vital finding is that pre-existing depression causes heart disease. Untreated depression is a primary independent risk factor for developing CVD.
Independent risk factor. That means you could be a marathon runner, you could have zero family history of heart disease, you could eat a pristine Mediterranean diet, and your cholesterol could be perfect.
But if you have clinical untreated depression, your risk of a cardiac event skyrockets purely because of the state of your brain.
It's wild.
It is. How does an emotional state physically damage the heart valves and arteries?
It comes back to the chronic activation of the stress response. Severe depression is characterized by autonomic nervous system imbalance.
The sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight accelerator, is constantly engaged, while the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest brake, is impaired.
Exactly. This chronic sympathetic overdrive physically increases heart rate and blood pressure, causing mechanical shear stress on the arterial walls. Furthermore, depression alters platelet reactivity.
Platelets being the cells in our blood that clump together to form clots when we get a cut.
Correct. In a depressed patient bathed in stress hormones, those platelets become hyperreactive. They become sticky.
They are much more likely to clump together inappropriately inside the arteries, forming the exact type of clots that lead to strokes and myocardial infarctions.
What is deeply frustrating is that the medical community noticed this connection almost a century ago. Researchers in the 1930s published data showing that individuals diagnosed with severe depression had statistically higher mortality rates from heart disease.
But because the medical establishment was so stubbornly siloed, the psychiatrists were in one building studying the mind and the cardiologists were in another building looking at EKGs, nobody bothered to investigate the bridge between the two.
Half a century of vital data was basically ignored because it didn't fit neatly into the biomedical filing cabinets. It wasn't until the 1980s that this relationship was finally taken seriously.
Okay, let's move lower down the body to the gut. The book spends a significant amount of time exploring functional gastrointestinal disorders, or FGIDs.
FGIDs encompass conditions like irritable bowel syndrome, or IBS. These are patients presenting with severe, chronic abdominal pain, intense bloating, and severe alterations in bowel habits.
But when a gastroenterologist performs a colonoscopy or an endoscopy, they don't find a bleeding ulcer, they don't find a tumor, they don't find obvious structural damage.
Which means these patients are prime targets for medical gaslighting. They get your scans are clear, it's just your anxiety speech.
And the numbers are huge. The book notes that somewhere between 35 and 70% of people will experience an FGID at some point in their lives.
It is incredibly prevalent. But rather than dismissing these symptoms, Dr. Trachman dives into the microscopic mechanisms of the gut-brain axis.
The gut and the brain are physically tethered together by the vagus nerve, which acts like a massive superhighway transmitting data in both directions.
The book specifically explores the mechanics of celiac disease, a severe autoimmune reaction to the protein gluten, and introduces the concept of leaky gut, which in the medical literature is referred to as intestinal hyperpermeability.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because our everyday language actually reflects an ancient, intuitive understanding of this connection.
Oh, like butterflies in my stomach.
Exactly. Or I made a gut decision, or I felt it in my gut. We intuitively know the stomach is processing emotional information, but the book introduces a very specific phrase: bread, brains, and the blues.
Yes.
I want to push on the biology here. It is one thing to feel nervous and get an upset stomach. It is entirely another to claim that eating a specific physical food, like a piece of wheat bread containing gluten, can literally alter the neurochemistry of the brain and cause clinical depression.
It sounds like science fiction, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
What is the actual chain of events happening at the cellular level?
It is an incredibly elegant, albeit destructive, mechanical breakdown. To understand it, we have to look at the architecture of the small intestine.
Okay.
The intestinal wall is lined with epithelial cells that are bound tightly together by structures called tight junctions. This wall is designed to be a highly selective, microscopic security checkpoint.
Its job is to absorb broken down nutrients into the bloodstream while keeping toxic pathogens, bacteria, and large undigested food particles trapped inside the digestive tract to be excreted.
Think of it like a velvet rope at a club. It lets the VIP nutrients in and keeps the dangerous elements out.
That's a perfect analogy, but in someone with celiac disease, ingesting gluten triggers the body's immune system to launch a violent attack on the lining of its own small intestine.
Right, and this information destroys the microvilli, the tiny hair-like structures that absorb nutrients, and it forces those tight junctions to break open. The velvet rope drops.
The intestine becomes hyperpermeable, it becomes leaky.
So now large inflammatory molecules, toxic elements, and bacterial fragments are crossing the gut wall and entering the systemic blood circulation.
Yes, they're circulating throughout the entire body. Now, the brain has its own velvet rope, a highly sophisticated defense mechanism called the blood-brain barrier, or the BBB.
It is a dense network of endothelial cells and astrocytes designed to prevent toxins in the blood from entering the central nervous system.
But the BBB is not invincible.
Far from it. Chronic systemic inflammation, like the kind driven by a constantly leaking gut, acts like a battering ram against the blood-brain barrier.
Over time, the inflammation compromises the integrity of the BBB. The toxic elements that leaked out of the gut cross over into the brain tissue.
And once inside, they trigger neuroinflammation, which profoundly disrupts the delicate balance of neurotransmitters. This directly leads to psychiatric complications.
Dr. Trachman actually cites data showing that clinical depression is twice as common in patients suffering from celiac disease compared to the general population.
So the leaky gut literally poisons the brain. But there's a second mechanism at play here too. Because the inflammation destroys the microvilli in the gut, it's not just about what is inappropriately getting into the bloodstream, it is about the vital building blocks that are suddenly not getting in.
Malabsorption is a massive piece of this puzzle. The patient might be eating a highly nutritious diet, but because their intestinal lining is fundamentally damaged, they simply cannot absorb the nutrients.
Scientific studies have consistently shown that patients with celiac disease suffer from chronically low levels of tryptophan.
Tryptophan being an essential amino acid, it's the raw material the body uses to synthesize serotonin, which is arguably our most important neurotransmitter for regulating mood, sleep, and feelings of well-being.
Precisely. You cannot build a house without bricks, and the brain cannot manufacture serotonin without tryptophan. These patients also suffer from profound deficiencies in B vitamins, which are critical for neurological function.
And they often exhibit decreased cerebral blood flow. So to directly answer how a piece of bread causes the blues, the physical autoimmune destruction of the gut architecture chemically starves the brain of the exact molecules it requires to maintain a stable, non-depressed state.
which means if a psychiatrist is only treating that patient with talk therapy or even standard SSRI antidepressants, they're completely missing the root cause.
Right, because the cure for their psychiatric depression relies entirely on healing the physical lining of their stomach so they can resume absorbing tryptophan.
That is the biopsychosocial model operating at its absolute highest level. It is completely fascinating.
It really is. But let's pivot and look at a different kind of trigger. We've just explored chronic internal dietary issues. The book also dedicates a massive amount of real estate to exploring what happens when an external invader, a virus, enters the body and hijacks this brain-body connection.
And the primary weapon these viruses use is inflammation. Inflammation is truly the common denominator, the underlying thread connecting almost all of these medically unexplainable conditions.
And when we examine the psychiatric impact of viruses, Dr. Trachman brings up the most massive global example of our time, COVID-19 and the ongoing, deeply complex phenomenon of long COVID.
The book points out that we are still in the infancy of understanding long COVID, but the psychiatric and neurological fallout is undeniable. We are seeing massive spikes in brain fog, severe anxiety, and crippling fatigue long after the acute respiratory symptoms have resolved.
Dr. Trachman approaches the COVID-19 impact through a dual lens. First, we must acknowledge the psychosocial trauma of the pandemic itself.
The profound isolation, the persistent fear of infection, the grief, the financial ruin, these act as massive, chronic psychological stressors.
And as we discussed earlier, severe chronic stress locks the autonomic nervous system into a continuous sympathetic fight-or-flight response.
The brain perceives a relentless threat, and it commands the body to produce a systemic inflammatory response in preparation for damage.
So the psychological environment of the pandemic caused widespread physiological inflammation, but the SARS-CoV-2 virus itself is a master of triggering extreme biological inflammation.
The book introduces a groundbreaking theory from a British psychiatrist named Dr. Edward Bullmore. He wrote a brilliant book called The Inflamed Mind, which Dr. Trachman cites heavily.
His postulate completely upends how we view psychiatric illness. He suggests that clinical depression might actually be a direct result of immune system activation.
It is a total paradigm reversal. For decades, the biomedical model assumed that the causality ran strictly one way. If you were severely depressed, your psychological state suppressed your immune system, making you more vulnerable to catching a cold or a virus.
Bullmore looked at the data and argued the exact opposite. He posits that getting infected with a virus and the resulting massive inflammatory response generated by your immune system to fight that virus actually causes the depression.
He's saying that depression is an evolutionary behavioral response to infection. It makes sense from a survival standpoint.
Yeah, if you are infected, the body wants you to isolate, to stop seeking pleasure, to lie down and conserve energy so the immune system can fight the bug. The immune system chemically forces the brain into a depressive state.
To bring this out of the theoretical realm, Dr. Trachman shares the harrowing story of a young woman named Allie. Allie's case perfectly illustrates this neuroimmune hijacking.
She was a brilliant undergraduate student at highly competitive Ivy League university, right?
Yes. Out of nowhere, she began experiencing debilitating brain fog, crippling panic attacks, and severe, uncharacteristic anxiety.
The standard biomedical assumption, and frankly Allie's own assumption, was that she was simply cracking under the immense psychological pressure of her academic environment.
She had to take a medical leave of absence because her cognitive function completely collapsed. She assumed it was a psychological failure.
But it turned out she was suffering from an active infection of the Epstein-Barr virus.
Epstein-Barr is the virus responsible for mononucleosis. In colloquial terms, the kissing disease.
The general public associates it with a sore throat, swollen lymph nodes, and needing to sleep for a few weeks. But the virus operates on a much more insidious level.
In Allie's case, the virus triggered an aggressive systemic immune response. Her immune cells released massive amounts of inflammatory proteins called cytokines.
And these cytokines didn't just stay in her throat or her bloodstream.
No, cytokines are capable of crossing the blood-brain barrier. Once inside the central nervous system, they activate the brain's own resident immune cells, which are called microglia.
Normally, microglia are like the gardeners of the brain, gently pruning connections and keeping the tissue healthy.
But when activated by inflammatory cytokines, they turn into aggressive soldiers. They release neurotoxins, they disrupt the synthesis of serotonin and dopamine, and they quite literally inflame the brain tissue.
So Allie's severe anxiety and panic attacks were not a psychological weakness. They were the direct mechanical symptoms of her brain tissue burning with viral inflammation.
And Epstein-Barr is not the only pathogen capable of this. The book extensively covers Lyme disease, which is a bacterial infection transmitted by tick bites.
In the medical community, Lyme is ominously referred to as the great imitator.
It earns that title because the bacteria has a corkscrew shape that allows it to burrow deep into various tissues, including the central nervous system.
Once there, it generates symptoms that mimic multiple sclerosis, ALS, or severe treatment-resistant psychiatric disorders like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia.
Dr. Trachman highlights the deeply disturbing experience of Amy Tan, the globally celebrated author of The Joy Luck Club. Tan contracted Lyme disease, but it went undiagnosed for a significant period.
She described a terrifying cognitive decline. She detailed how her mind slowed down so drastically that while driving, she couldn't process information fast enough to determine whether a red traffic light meant she should press the brake pedal or the gas pedal.
Think about the sheer terror of that experience. A world-class author, someone whose entire identity is built on high-level cognitive processing and linguistic mastery, suddenly unable to decode the meaning of a red light.
It exposes just how fragile our high-level cognitive functions are when the underlying hardware is subjected to physiological inflammation.
It is a profound vulnerability and raises an incredibly urgent question regarding how we practice psychiatry.
Exactly. So, if depression can be caused by inflammation, are we treating psychiatric issues all wrong? Like, could an anti-inflammatory drug treat depression?
What's fascinating here is that Dr. Trachman's book provides some of its most thrilling scientific validation on this exact point. She details a landmark study published in the highly prestigious journal Nature.
What did they do?
The researchers recruited 42 subjects who had been formally diagnosed with major depressive disorder. But crucially, they screened these patients using a blood test to measure their levels of C-reactive protein, or CRP.
CRP is a biomarker produced by the liver. When it is elevated in the blood, it is definitive proof that there is a high level of acute inflammation happening somewhere in the body.
Correct. So the researchers isolated a group of patients who were both clinically depressed and biologically inflamed. They then divided this cohort into two distinct groups.
The control group received a standard placebo.
The experimental group, however, received a single dose of a biological medication that is typically prescribed to treat severe autoimmune arthritis. It was a potent, targeted anti-inflammatory drug designed to reduce joint swelling.
They gave an arthritis drug to psychiatric patients. What were the results?
The researchers monitored both groups for 2 weeks. They didn't just ask them how they felt. They subjected them to rigorous cognitive tasks specifically designed to measure motivation and reward-seeking behavior.
These are functions driven by the neurotransmitter dopamine, and they are notoriously suppressed in patients suffering from major depression. It's a symptom known as anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure.
The results were nothing short of revolutionary. The group that received the single dose of the anti-inflammatory joint medication demonstrated a massive, statistically significant increase in their willingness to engage in tasks associated with rewards.
Wait, really? They completely outperformed the placebo group?
Yes. A medication engineered to reduce physical swelling in the knees physically altered their brain chemistry enough to restore their psychiatric motivation.
Because it extinguished the fire in the brain. It reduced the neuroinflammation, which allowed the microglia to calm down, which in turn allowed the dopamine circuits to function normally again.
This study provides hard, irrefutable proof that inflammation is a physical etiology, a root biological cause for depression in a specific subset of patients.
The implications of that are staggering. It means that for the roughly 1/3 of depressed patients who are classified as treatment-resistant, the people who have tried every SSRI on the market, gone to years of therapy, and still feel completely hopeless, we might simply be using the wrong tools.
We've been trying to fix their serotonin receptors when their immune system is what is actually broken. If the depression is immune-mediated, you have to treat the immune system.
Exactly. Which transitions us into one of the most complex and misdiagnosed areas of medicine. We've seen how external viruses can provoke the immune system into inflaming the brain.
Well, we must examine what happens when the immune system goes completely rogue, misfiring and launching a massive inflammatory assault without any external viral trigger at all.
We are entering the dark, confusing territory of autoimmune disorders. This is the biological equivalent of friendly fire.
The body's incredibly sophisticated defense mechanisms lose their ability to distinguish between a dangerous foreign invader and the body's own healthy native tissue.
The immune system's T cells and B cells literally start attacking the organs they were designed to protect.
Dr. Trachman explores devastating autoimmune conditions like systemic lupus erythematosus and fibromyalgia, and she points out a deeply tragic reality regarding how these patients are treated by the medical establishment.
These disorders are constantly, routinely mischaracterized as primary psychiatric illnesses.
The reason for this massive rate of misdiagnosis is the immense overlap in clinical presentation. When a patient with an early-stage autoimmune disease presents to a primary care doctor, they complain of intractable sleep issues, crushing, unrefreshing fatigue, severe brain fog, and diffuse joint or muscle ache.
And if a doctor operates strictly on a 15-minute appointment schedule, runs a standard superficial blood panel that happens to miss the highly specific antinuclear antibodies, they look at that patient profile, tired, achy, can't concentrate, and the biomedical algorithm instantly spits out a diagnosis. You are suffering from major depression.
Here is a prescription for an antidepressant. And that misdiagnosis isn't just frustrating, it can be fatal.
To illustrate the extreme danger of this psychiatric misattribution, Dr. Trachman highlights the highly publicized case of Susanna Cahalan.
Cahalan was a bright, successful young journalist working in New York City who authored the best-selling memoir Brain on Fire.
Her descent into illness was rapid and terrifying. She began experiencing intense paranoia, auditory and visual hallucinations, severe insomnia, and highly erratic, sometimes violent behavior.
If a young adult suddenly presents with paranoia and hallucinations, almost any emergency room in the country is going to immediately assume a psychiatric break.
And that is exactly what happened. She was admitted to a psychiatric ward. A team of psychiatrists observed her symptoms and diagnosed her first with bipolar disorder, experiencing a manic episode.
As she deteriorated further, they revised the diagnosis to schizoaffective disorder. They prepared to send her to a long-term psychiatric facility.
Because according to the textbook, her behavior perfectly matched the criteria in the DSM.
Fortunately, her case was reviewed by a brilliant neurologist named Dr. Sohel Najjar, who refused to accept the psychiatric label. He dug deeper and finally uncovered the truth. Her symptoms had zero psychiatric origin.
She was suffering from an incredibly rare autoimmune disease known as anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis. Let's break down the mechanics of that because the name itself is intimidating. What exactly was her immune system doing to her brain?
The NMDA receptors are critical structures located on the neurons in the brain. They act as gateways for glutamate, which is a neurotransmitter essential for learning, memory, and regulating reality.
In Cahalan's case, her immune system started producing rogue antibodies that specifically targeted and attacked these NMDA receptors.
The antibodies bound to the receptors, physically blocking them from functioning. When you block NMDA receptors, the brain's communication network completely short-circuits.
The physical result of that biological short circuit is extreme paranoia, hallucinations, and psychotic behavior. So she wasn't experiencing a psychological breakdown. Her brain was quite literally under a violent inflammatory immune attack. It was on fire.
Exactly. And the proof of the biological origin was in the cure. Once Dr. Najjar diagnosed the encephalitis, he didn't treat her with antipsychotic medications or talk therapy.
He treated the autoimmune condition. He used aggressive therapies like plasmapheresis to filter the rogue antibodies out of her blood and high-dose steroids to suppress her immune system's inflammatory response.
Once the biological fire was extinguished, she made a full recovery. Her severe psychiatric symptoms vanished completely.
It is a terrifying testament to how easily a severe biological illness can masquerade as madness. Following Cahalan's story, Dr. Trachman wades into what might be the most deeply misunderstood and marginalized condition in modern medicine, chronic fatigue syndrome.
Also known as myalgic encephalomyelitis, or MECFS. This condition is a diagnostic nightmare. It is the poster child for medically unexplained symptoms.
The book introduces us to a patient named Jessica to humanize the statistics. Jessica was a highly successful professional working for a government agency. She was deeply integrated into the medical world, being the daughter of 2 physicians.
Yet she developed a cluster of bizarre, debilitating symptoms. She developed extreme neurological hypersensitivity to everyday smells and a profound crushing fatigue that is the hallmark of the disease.
And it is crucial to define that fatigue. The fatigue in CFS is not the kind of tired you feel after pulling an all-nighter or running a marathon. It is a fundamental cellular energy crisis.
It features a symptom called post-exertional malaise, meaning that even minimal physical or cognitive effort, like taking a shower or reading an email, can cause a total physiological crash that lasts for days.
You absolutely cannot sleep off chronic fatigue syndrome.
No, rest does not cure it. Yet, despite Jessica's medical pedigree and the severity of her collapse, she struggled immensely to secure any validation from the medical establishment.
Because CFS lacks a simple, definitive diagnostic blood test, there is no single biomarker that a lab tech can flag in red ink. It falls into a clinical void.
When doctors cannot objectively test for a disease, the biomedical model trains them to doubt its existence. Dr. Trachman quotes an author named Toni Bernhard, who herself suffers from CFS.
Bernhard recalled the astonishing gaslighting she endured, stating, "I've had doctors tell me there's no such thing. One doctor said, just drink some coffee."
Drink some coffee. A medical professional looked at a patient whose entire central nervous system and cellular energy production was collapsing and suggested a caffeinated beverage.
It is infuriating, but it perfectly illustrates the arrogance of a system that assumes if it cannot measure something easily, the patient must be hysterical.
But Dr. Trachman aggressively counters this ignorance with hard data. The book highlights that we do understand significant aspects of CFS biology.
The scientific literature is clear. CFS onset is very frequently triggered by a severe viral infection. Even Dr. Anthony Fauci is cited in the book, publicly noting the striking, almost identical physiological similarities between long COVID patients today and the classic presentation of post-viral CFS.
Furthermore, while standard cheap blood panels might return normal results, highly specialized neuroimaging studies paint a very different picture.
When researchers use advanced functional MRIs or PE scans, they find objective, measurable physical alterations.
They see widespread neuroinflammation and microglial activation in the brains and spinal cords of CFS patients compared to healthy control subjects.
The physical damage is there. It is not in their minds. It is deeply embedded in their central nervous system. But Dr. Trachman doesn't just stop at the biology.
True to the biopsychosocial model, she forces us to look at the psychological sphere as well. And this is where the book introduces a fascinating, albeit controversial, psychological link.
There is a documented connection in the research between the development of chronic fatigue syndrome and a specific personality trait known as maladaptive perfectionism.
Okay, I need to pause the train right here. If I'm a patient suffering from CFS and I hear that, I'm going to be highly defensive.
Wait, is this saying that being a perfectionist physically breaks down your immune system?
It is a vital question,
Yep.
and it is imperative that we parse the mechanics carefully so it does not sound like victim blaming. We are observing the ultimate tragic manifestation of the mind-body cascade.
Right. Maladaptive perfectionism is not simply a desire to have a tidy desk or to do a good job. In psychological terms, it is a relentless, punishing, inescapable internal standard.
A maladaptive perfectionist links their core human worth entirely to flawless performance. Therefore, they live in a constant, perpetual state of perceived failure or the terror of impending failure.
So, using our earlier analogy, the CEO in the brain is never at peace. Even when things are fine, the CEO is frantically screaming that the company is about to go bankrupt.
Precisely. And the biological hardware of the human body cannot differentiate between the acute physical stress of being chased by a predator and the chronic psychological stress of your own crushing internal expectations.
Both stimuli trigger the exact same neuroendocrine alarm system. The brain forces the adrenal glands to continuously pump out cortisol and adrenaline. The sympathetic nervous system is locked in the on position for years.
And as we established when talking about the heart and the gut, chronic exposure to stress hormones initiates a relentless systemic inflammatory response. It creates a massive allostatic load.
Allostatic load is the cumulative wear and tear on the biological systems caused by chronic overactivation of the stress response.
It's like running a car engine at 7,000 RPMs while setting in park for 3 years. Eventually, the mechanical parts are going to shatter.
In conditions like CFS and its closely related cousin, fibromyalgia, this chronic inflammatory state eventually burns out the regulatory systems.
The constant flood of stress chemicals degrades the body's ability to regulate key neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, which are intimately involved in filtering pain signals and generating cellular energy.
So the psychological trait of maladaptive perfectionism creates a highly toxic internal physiological environment. And when that depleted, inflamed environment encounters an external trigger like the Epstein-Barr virus or COVID-19 city, the immune system essentially shatters,
Resulting in the biological disease of CFS. It is a staggering chain of causality. And in discussing these invisible autoimmune-driven illnesses, there's a massive elephant in the room that Dr. Trachman addresses head-on. We have to talk about the gender bias.
The statistics surrounding gender in these conditions are impossible to ignore. The book notes that approximately three-quarters, 75% of all patients diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome are women.
When you look at the broader category of autoimmune disorders like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and Hashimoto's, the vast majority of sufferers are female.
And the historical and current medical response to this demographic reality represents a profound systemic failure. The bias is literally quantified in the book.
Dr. Trachman cites a highly disturbing study analyzing emergency room wait times. The data shows that women who present to the ER complaining of severe abdominal pain wait, on average, almost 33% longer to receive medical evaluation and pain medication than men who present with the exact same symptoms.
A third longer left suffering in a waiting room, purely based on their gender. This disparity does not occur in a vacuum.
It is the modern echo of a deep-seated historical medical bias that inherently views female physical complaints as less critical, exaggerated, or fundamentally driven by emotional instability rather than biological pathology.
The book points out the etymology of the word hysteria, which is mind-blowing. It derives directly from hystera, the ancient Greek word for uterus.
For centuries, the smartest medical minds in the world operated on the literal belief that a woman's unexplained physical ailments, pain, or emotional distress were mechanically caused by her uterus detaching and wandering freely around her body, disrupting other organs.
They called it the wandering womb. It's just wild to think about.
While modern doctors no longer believe in a wandering uterus, the cultural residue of that sexism remains deeply embedded in the clinical subconscious.
We like to flatter ourselves that modern medicine is purely objective, but the hard data, the 33% longer wait times, the exponentially higher rates of female patients being told it is all in your head, proves that the shadow of hysteria is still actively harming patients today.
Which brings us to the ultimate question. What do we do with all this information? We have journeyed through an incredibly dense, complex landscape.
We've exposed the massive flaws in the purely biological medical model. We've seen how the brain and body are inextricably intertwined through the gut-brain axis, the cardiovascular system, and the immune system.
We've seen the devastating power of viral inflammation and the insidious reality of medical gender bias.
Having thoroughly deconstructed the problem, Dr. Trachman uses the final section of her book to provide highly actionable defensive strategies. She essentially provides a blueprint for the patient to become their own medical project manager.
Or, as she puts it, their own medical Sherlock Holmes. It is a necessary evolution. When the prevailing medical system is structurally not designed to solve your specific type of complex, multi-systemic problem, you can no longer be a passive participant in your healthcare.
So what does this all mean for the patient? You have to actively guide the investigation. She begins this action plan by explicitly defining the behavior patients need to watch out for: medical gaslighting.
We use that term a lot in pop culture, but in a clinical setting, what does it actually look like?
Medical gaslighting occurs when a healthcare provider systematically dismisses your valid concerns. It is when they blame your concrete physical symptoms, like joint swelling, tremors, or severe pain, on vague, unquantifiable concepts like stress or anxiety without conducting a thorough investigation.
It is the outright refusal to order specialized labs or provide referrals to specialists when the patient knows intimately that their body is failing.
And Dr. Trachman grounds this phenomenon not just in doctor arrogance, but in a very grim logistical reality of modern healthcare economics. The book states that the average primary care doctor's office visit is currently scheduled for only 18 minutes.
18 minutes. That is barely enough time to check blood pressure, review a basic metabolic panel, and write a prescription for a standard ailment like strep throat.
It is an absolute setup for failure. If you walk into an 18-minute window and try to explain 3 years of complex, overlapping, multi-systemic symptoms fatigue that mimic CFS, brain fog that looks like Lyme, and stomach issues that look like celiac, the doctor's going to be overwhelmed, look at the clock, and default to the easiest psychological explanation.
So Dr. Trachman's action plan is designed to maximize those 18 minutes. Her first, and perhaps most vital rule: never go to a critical appointment alone. Always bring a trusted friend, partner, or a relative.
The psychology behind this is crucial. When you are severely ill, you are inherently vulnerable. You might be suffering from brain fog, extreme fatigue, or you might simply be intimidated by the power dynamic of the white coat.
Having a second person in the room, someone who is not sick, who has a clear head, and who can take detailed notes, fundamentally changes the dynamic of the encounter.
It adds an immediate layer of accountability. The doctor is far less likely to be dismissive when a healthy advocate is sitting in the corner taking notes.
Her second rule is to do the prep work. Make a concise, prioritize lists of your symptoms and questions beforehand. Do not rely on your compromised memory when the doctor is standing by the door with their hand on the doorknob.
Third, you have to shed the fear of challenging authority. Do not be afraid to explicitly ask for specific, specialized labs or to demand a referral to a rheumatologist or an immunologist. You are essentially hiring them as a consultant to do a job.
Which perfectly aligns with her fourth recommendation. You must treat the process of finding a doctor exactly like you would treat hiring a general contractor to rebuild your house.
You would never let a random stranger tear apart your kitchen without exhaustively checking their references and reviews.
Dr. Trachman urges patients to utilize resources like health grades, WebMD physician directories, and patient advocacy forums to research a provider's reputation before booking an appointment. You want to see if other patients with complex chronic illnesses have felt heard and respected by that specific physician.
And finally, she advocates for bringing actual evidence into the room. She suggests bringing a physical copy of her book or printed, highlighted copies of peer-reviewed research papers.
It completely alters the tone of the conversation. Instead of passively saying, "Doctor, my stomach hurts and I feel sad," you are saying, "I am experiencing gastrointestinal distress and anhedonia, and I would like to investigate whether a biopsychosocial mechanism like intestinal hyperpermeability might be contributing. Can we run a celiac panel?"
But I want to push back on this entire premise, not because it's wrong, but because it feels incredibly heavy. The patient we are talking about is already exhausted, their mitochondria aren't producing energy, their brain is in flames, they are in chronic pain, and now Dr. Trachman is telling them they have to act as their own medical researcher, project manager, and legal advocate just to get basic care.
It is an immense, objectively unfair burden. Acknowledging that unfairness is the first step. But Dr. Trachman counters that despair with a deeply empowering, pragmatic perspective. She offers the reader a simple, grounding mantra: progress, not perfection.
Because healing under the biopsychosocial model isn't a single event, it's an ongoing process.
Precisely. Wellness is an active, dynamic process that must encompass all three spheres: the physical, the psychological, and the social. You start by making one small change to reduce your overall allostatic load.
Maybe that means aggressively eliminating an inflammatory food from your diet to help patch the tight junctions in your gut.
Maybe it means committing to a specific daily breathing technique to manually force your autonomic nervous system out of sympathetic fight or flight and into parasympathetic rest.
Or maybe it simply means firing a dismissive doctor and finding one who is willing to listen for 25 minutes instead of 18. Every single one of those actions removes a tiny fraction of the burden off the CEO in the brain, allowing the biology a chance to repair itself.
And Dr. Trachman leaves the reader with perhaps the most profound and validating message of all. You know your body better than any medical professional on earth.
A doctor may have spent 10 years studying textbook pathology, but you have spent your entire life living inside your specific biological ecosystem.
Their expertise isn't general medicine. Your expertise is in you. When you find a provider willing to combine those two distinct areas of expertise as equal partners, true, lasting healing finally becomes possible.
That is an incredibly powerful, hard-earned takeaway. We have covered an immense, complex landscape today. We started with the sheer alienating frustration of being told an agonizing physical illness is all in your head, simply because the archaic X-ray machine came back clean.
We explored George Engel's biopsychosocial model, detailing the epigenetic proof that your psychological environment, your chronic stress, and your social standing literally rewrite your cellular biology.
We traveled down the vagus nerve to explore the gut-brain axis, unpacking the mechanics of how a damaged, leaky intestinal wall can chemically starve the brain of the serotonin it needs to feel joy.
We ventured into the terrifying reality of the inflamed mind, discovering how viruses like COVID-19 and Epstein-Barr trigger massive immune responses that cross the blood-brain barrier and manifest as severe treatment-resistant psychiatric conditions.
And we tackled the complex, heavily biased world of autoimmune disorders and chronic fatigue syndrome, ending with a concrete, tactical plan to advocate for yourself and survive an 18-minute medical visit. It has been a profound journey into the reality of invisible illness.
And as we close, I want to leave you with a final, somewhat provocative thought to ponder a logical extension of everything we've analyzed today regarding the biopsychosocial model.
What is it?
We have firmly established, using hard biological data, that our thoughts, our social environments, and our chronic stress levels can literally, physically alter our DNA expression. They can cause systemic inflammation, break open our intestinal walls, rewire our neurotransmitters, and force our immune systems to attack our own brains.
Right.
If all of that is scientifically true, how much of our modern society's standard operating procedure, the hyper-stressed, always-on, sleep-deprived, economically anxious 40-plus hour work week, is actually a massive, completely unacknowledged public health crisis?
Are we pouring billions of dollars into hospitals, desperately trying to treat the biological symptoms of a fundamentally sick society, instead of having the courage to cure the toxic psychosocial environment we are forcing the human animal to live in? That really reframes the entire concept of the morning commute, doesn't it? It brings us right back to the beginning of our deep dive. The next time you feel that ache, that profound fatigue, that terrifying symptom that nobody can seem to adequately explain, remember that the medical X-ray machine is only designed to see bones.
It doesn't see the whole picture, it doesn't see the mind, it doesn't see the weight of your environment, and it doesn't see the incredibly complex, beautiful, and sometimes chaotic microscopic connections between them all.
Your physical experience is real. It's not just in your head. Thanks for diving deep with us. Please subscribe and like to hear new book summaries.